I'm Caiti, and I have decided that I am going to start reading out loud. And last week I read the prologue of Ranger's Apprentice by John Flanagan, an Australian author. This is The Ruins of Gorlan, the first of the, I think there's about 12 books. In the prologue it talked about Morgorath, who is this evil kind of lordish kind of person that tried to take over the kingdom. Okay. Do something every day that scares you, says my fridge magnet that someone very kindly bought for me. Last RTX? Anyway. Okay. Chapter 1 of Ranger's Apprentice, The Ruins of Gorlan. Try to eat something, Will. Tomorrow's a big day after all. Jenny, blonde, pretty, and cheerful, gestured towards Will's barely touched plate and smiled encouragingly at him. Will made an attempt to return the smile, but it was a dismal failure. He picked at the plate before him, piled high with his favorite foods. Tonight, his stomach knotted tight with tension and anticipation. He could barely bring himself to swallow a bite. Tomorrow would be a big day, he knew. He knew all too well, in fact. Tomorrow would be the biggest day in his life because tomorrow was the choosing day, and it would determine how he spent the rest of his life. Nerves, I imagine, said George, setting down his loaded fork and seizing the lapels of his jacket in a judicious manner. He was a thin, gangly, and studious boy, fascinated by rules and regulations, and with a penchant for examining and debating both sides of any question, sometimes at great length. Dreadful thing, nervousness. It can just freeze you up so you can't think, can't eat, can't speak. I'm not nervous, Will said quickly, noticing that Horace had looked up, ready to form a sarcastic comment. George nodded several times, considering Will's statement. On the other hand, he added, a little nervousness can actually improve performance. It can heighten your perceptions and sharpen your reactions. So, the fact that you are worried, if in fact you are, is not necessarily something to be worried about, of itself, so to speak. In spite of himself, a smile touched Will's mouth. George would be a natural in the legal profession, he thought. He would almost certainly be the scribe-master's choice on the following morning. Perhaps, Will thought, that was at the very heart of his own problem. He was the only one of the 5 ward-mates who had any fears about the choosing that would take place within 12 hours. He ought to be nervous, Horace scoffed. After all, which craft master is going to want him as an apprentice? I'm sure we're all nervous, Elise said. She directed one of her rare smiles at Will. We'd be stupid not to be. Well, I'm not, Horace said, then reddened as Elise raised one eyebrow and Jenny giggled. It was typical of Elise, Will thought. He knew that tall, graceful girl had already been promised a place as an apprentice by Lady Pauline, head of Castle Redmont's diplomatic service. Her pretense that she was nervous about the following day, and her tact in refraining from pointing out Horace's gaffe showed that she was already a diplomat of some skill. Jenny, of course, would gravitate immediately to the castle kitchens, domain of Master Chubb, Redmont's head chef. He was a man renowned throughout the kingdom for the banquets served in the castle's massive dining hall. Jenny loved food and cooking, and her easygoing nature and unfailing good humor would make her an invaluable staff member in the turmoil of the castle kitchens. Battle school would be Horace's choice. Will glanced at his wardmate now, hungrily tucking into the roast turkey, ham, and potatoes that he had heaped onto his plate. Horace was big for his age and a natural athlete. The chances that he would be refused were virtually non-existent. Horace was exactly the type of recruit that Sir Rodney looked for in his warrior apprentices. Strong, athletic, fit, and Will thought a trifle sourly, not too bright. Battle school was the path to knighthood for boys like Horace, born commoners but with the physical abilities to serve as knights of the kingdom. Which left Will. What would his choice be? More importantly, as Horace had pointed out, what craftmaster would accept him as an apprentice? For choosing day was the pivotal point in the life of the castle wards. They were orphan children raised by the generosity of Baron Arold, the lord of Redmont Fief. For the most part, their parents had died in the service of the fief, and the Barold saw it as his responsibility to care for and raise the children of his former subjects, and to give them an opportunity to improve their station in life wherever possible. Choosing Day provided that opportunity. Each year, castle wards turning 15 could apply to be apprenticed to the masters of the various crafts that served the castle and its people. Ordinarily, craft apprentices were selected by dint of their parents' occupation or influence with the craft masters. The castle wards usually had no such influence, and this was their chance to win a future for themselves. Those wards who weren't chosen, or for whom no openings could be found, would be assigned to farming families in the nearby village, providing farm labor to raise the crops and animals that fed the castle inhabitants. It was rare for this to happen, Will knew. The Baron and his craftmasters usually went out of their way to fit the wards into one craft or another. But it could happen, and it was a fate he feared more than anything. Horace caught his eye now and gave him a smug smile. "Still planning on applying for battle school, Will?" he asked, through a mouthful of turkey and potatoes. "Better eat something then, you'll need to build yourself up a little." He snorted with laughter, and Will glowered at him. A few weeks previously, Horace had overheard Will confiding to Elise that he desperately wanted to be selected for battle school, and he had made Will's life a misery ever since, pointing out on every possible occasion that Will's slight build was totally unsuited for the rigors of battle school training. The fact that Horace was probably right only made matters worse. Where Horace was tall and muscular, Will was small and wiry. He was agile and fast and surprisingly strong, but he simply didn't have the size that he knew was required of battle school apprentices. He hoped against hope for the past few years that he would have what people called his growing spurt before the choosing day came around. But it had never happened, and now the day was nearly here. As Will said nothing, Horace sensed that he had scored a verbal hit. This was a rarity in their turbulent relationship. Over the past few years, he and Will had clashed repeatedly. Being the stronger of the two, Horace usually got the better of Will, although very occasionally, Will's speed and agility allowed him to get in a surprise kick or punch and then escape before Horace could catch him. But while Horace generally had the best of their physical clashes, it was unusual for him to win any of their verbal encounters. Will's wit was as agile as the rest of him, and he almost always managed to have the last word. In fact, it was this tendency that often led to trouble between them. Will was yet to learn that having the last word was not always a good idea. Horace decided now to press his advantage. "You need muscles to get into battle school, Will. Real muscles," he said, glancing at the others around the table to see if anyone disagreed. The other wards, uncomfortable at the growing tension between the two boys, concentrated on their plates. "Particularly between the ears," Will replied, and unfortunately, Jenny couldn't refrain from giggling. Horace's face flushed, and he started to rise from his seat. But Will was quicker, and he was already at the door before Horace could disentangle himself from his chair. He contented himself with hurling a final insult after his retreating wardmate. "That's right, run away, Will No-Name. You're a no-name and nobody will want you as an apprentice." Outside, Will heard the parting sally and felt blood rush to his cheeks. It was the taunt he hated most, although he had tried never to let Horace know that, sensing that he would provide the bigger boy with a weapon if he did. The truth was, nobody knew Will's second name. Nobody knew who his parents had been. Unlike his yearmates, who had lived in the fief before their parents had died, and whose family histories were known, Will had appeared virtually out of nowhere as a newborn baby. He had been found wrapped in a small blanket and placed in a basket on the steps of the ward building 15 years ago. A note had been attached to the blanket, reading simply, "His mother died in childbirth. His father died a hero. Please care for him. His name is Will." That year, there had only been one other ward. Elisa's father was a cavalry lieutenant who had died in the battle at Hackham Heath, when Morgrath's Wargle army had been defeated and driven back to the mountains. Elisa's mother, devastated by her loss, succumbed to a fever some weeks after giving birth, so there was plenty of room at the ward for the unknown child, and Baron Arold was, at heart, a kindly man. Even though the circumstances were unusual, he had given permission for Will to be accepted as a ward of Castle Redmont. It seemed logical to assume that, if the note were true, Will's father had died in the war against Morgorath, and since Baron Arold had taken a leading part in that war, he felt duty-bound to honor the unknown father's sacrifice. So Will had become a Redmont ward, raised and educated by the Baron's generosity. As time passed, the others had gradually joined him, and Elise until there were 5 in their year group. But while the others had memories of their parents, or, in Elise's case, people who had known them and could tell her about them, Will knew nothing of his past. That was why he had invented the story that sustained him throughout his childhood in the ward, and as the years passed and he added detail and color to the story, he eventually came to believe it himself. His father, he knew, had died a hero's death, so it made sense to create a picture of him as a hero, a knight warrior in full armor, fighting against the Wargle hordes, cutting them down left and right until eventually he was overcome by sheer weight of numbers. Will had pictured the tall figure so often in his mind, seeing every detail of his armor and his equipment but never being able to visualize his face. As a warrior, his father would expect him to follow in his footsteps. That was why selection for battle school was so important to Will, and that was why, the more unlikely it became that he would be selected, the more desperately he clung to the hope that he might. He exited from the ward building into the darkened castle yard. The sun was long down, and the torches placed every 20 meters or so on the castle walls shed a flickering, uneven light. He hesitated a moment. He would not return to the ward and face Horace's continued taunts. To do so would only lead to another fight between them, a fight Will knew he would probably lose. George would probably try to analyze the situation for him, looking at both sides of the question and thoroughly confusing the issue. Elise and Jenny might try to comfort him, he knew, Elise particularly since they had grown up together. But at the moment he didn't want their sympathy, and he couldn't face Horace's taunts, so he headed for the one place he knew he could find his solitude. The huge fig tree growing close by the castle's central tower had often afforded him a haven. Heights held no fear for Will, and he climbed smoothly into the tree, keeping going long after another might have stopped, until he was in the lighter branches at the very top, branches which swayed and dipped under his weight. In the past, he had often escaped from Horace up here. The bigger boy couldn't match Will's speed in the tree, and he was unwilling to follow as high as this. Will found a convenient fork and wedged himself in it, his body giving slightly to the movement of the tree as the branches swayed in the evening breeze. Below, the foreshortened figures of the watch made their rounds of the castle yard. He heard the door of the ward building open, and looking down, saw Elise emerge, looking around the yard for him in vain. The tall girl hesitated a few moments, then, seeming to shrug, turned back inside. The elongated rectangle of light that the open door threw across the yard was cut off as she closed the door softly behind her. Strange, he thought, how seldom people tend to look up. There was a rustle of soft feathers, and a barn owl landed on the branch next to Will, his head swiveling, its huge eyes catching every last ray of the faint light. It studied him without concern, seeming to know it had nothing to fear from him. It was a hunter, a silent flyer, a ruler of the night. "At least you know who you are," he said softly to the bird. It swiveled its head again, then launched itself off into the darkness, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Gradually, as he sat there, the lights in the castle windows went out, one by one. The torches burnt down to smoldering husks and were replaced at midnight by the change of watch. Eventually, there was only one light left burning, and that, he knew, was in the Baron's study, where the Lord of Redmont was still presumably at work, poring over reports and papers. The study was virtually level with Will's position in the tree, and he could see the burly figure of the Baron seated at his desk. Finally, Baron Arold rose, stretched, and leaned forward to extinguish the lamp as he left the room, heading for his sleeping quarters on the floor above. Now the castle was asleep, except for the guards on the walls, who kept constant watch. In less than 9 hours, Will realized, he would face the choosing. Silently, miserably, fearing the worst, he climbed down from the tree and made his way to his bed, in the darkened boys' dormitory in the ward. And that's it for chapter 1. Thank you so much for hanging out for the first chapter. I'm still kind of working on their accents. But as the chapters go on, obviously there's more dialogue and they talk a little bit more. But yeah, thanks for hanging out. I'm gonna do this really weird thing because I'm not sure. But I'm just gonna like hold this book up and look into the camera so that I can make a thumbnail. Cool, now we've got that. Jack. Thank you again. This is a really good book. I don't know if you want to wait for me to read it to you or if you want to pick it up, but I love it. It's one of my favorites. I think we figured out that it was from like 2004. Yeah, 2004. And also, they're actually making this into a film. So here's hoping, because there's like 12 books of it, here's hoping that it can be as big as the Harry Potter franchise, because I really do love these books. So thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate it. I had a lot of fun. Thank you for coming and sharing that with me, and I will see you next week at a time to be established. You can follow me on Twitter. It's Caiti Ward _. I have Facebook, which is just Caiti Ward. Snapchat, which is just Caiti Ward. Everything is Caiti Ward except Twitter, which is very frustrating. There's an _ underneath it. But anyway, I will keep you updated. Thank you again. I'm so grateful. Ranger's Apprentice. See you next time.